Today, we are going to cover the following topics. We'll start off with a little bit of an overview of the program and the cohort. I will introduce you to the American History and Civics program team. We'll talk about a little bit about first steps and getting started with with your grant. We'll talk a little bit about how you'll be interfacing with ed staff, with the program officers assigned to your grant. A little bit as well. We'll also talk a little bit about what grant implementation looks like and how you'll be using those funds. And then, of course, we will discuss performance reporting, and then we'll have time for Q&A, as I mentioned at the end. All right, so as you know, we are this afternoon discussing the American History and Civics FY25 grant program. The authority for the program is under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Title II, Part B, Subpart 3, Section 2233, which for those of you that are familiar with this program will recognize that this is the section that relates to the American History and Civics National Activities Program. And although that there was a sort of a shift, for this competition, where you'll see it sort of labeled as the American History and Civics Seminars Program, it is very much rooted in the foundation of the American History and Civics National Activities Program. And so the purpose of this, of this grant really rests on two sort of principles, right? And the first of which is to promote new and existing evidence-based strategies to encourage innovative American history, civics, and government, and geography instruction, which will be familiar to those of you that are familiar with this program. The second point, however, does place emphasis on supporting seminars for educators or students in honor of the 250th anniversary of America's founding, which will be taking place next year. And this program has a 3-year period performance, which starts on October 1st, 2025, and will end on September 30th, 2028. And it's a 3-year period of performance, but each year of that period of performance is also its own separate period of performance, and we will be reviewing individually. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that works a little bit later. For this competition, we made 85 new awards, which for those of you that have followed this program for some time will know that that is far and away the largest number of awards that have ever been made under the American History and Civics, grants in any one competition. Actually, I think it exceeds, if we were to total up all the awards that have been made since the, initial launch of the program, it actually exceeds that by quite a bit. And the total obligation was almost $160 million for those 85 grants. And you will find that the grants have a funding range of between $509,000 and just under $3 million. We made grants, you can see that little table towards the bottom of the screen, really just shows sort of the geographic distribution, with 22 grants being made in the Midwest, 6 in the Northeast, 41 in the South, and 16 in the West, for a total of 85, as I mentioned before. And this screen right here is just to kind of give you a little bit of a map view of sort of the geographic sort of representation of where these grants fall. And you can sort of see that we really, I think, did a great job of getting awards to not every state, but quite a lot of states, and more certainly than we normally have been able to touch in previous competitions. All right, so I want to go ahead and introduce the American History and Civics program officers. And so I think the way I'll do this, I'll just kind of read the names, and then I'll just ask maybe everyone to sort of, I'm trying to think what's the best way to do this. Maybe have you just say hi or wave or something. If you want to come off, if you don't want to come off mute, that's fine. But I'll start off with Dr. Joshua Batchelor.
Hello, everyone.
And Donna DeFino.
Hi, everyone.
Dr. Brian Hill. I'll move on. I know Melissa Harper Butler is not able to be with us today, but I'll say hello for her and I'll wave as well. Dr. Michelle Kennedy.
Hello, everyone.
Nikki Palmore.
Hello, everyone.
And Monet Peterson-Cox.
Hello, everyone.
And Alan Rogers.
Hello, everyone.
And Terrell Sample.
Greetings, everyone.
All right. And so by now you should have heard from your program officer. I know they're in the process of reaching out to grantees and setting up initial post-award calls that are going to be taking place over the course of the next several weeks. So they are looking forward to connecting with you and supporting you, and just wanted to kind of give you the opportunity to put names to faces, and I know that they will be supporting you well over the next several years. So the primary role of the program officer sort of falls under two domains. And so the first thing that they will be doing is really working with you and making sure that you have all the technical assistance and support that you need. And so they'll do that, one, by making sure that you have access to all the important, ed-related resources and information that you need in order to be successful. They're also going to be, periodically conducting needs assessments, and providing guidance and support to make sure, again, that you have everything that you need in order to be successful. Make sure that we, as a sort of collective, have a sense of what sort of concerns are rising from the portfolio of grantees, what types of challenges that you all are facing as you implement your grant, so that we can make sure that you have the best support possible. The other thing they'll be doing is they'll be monitoring, to make sure that you are in compliance with any applicable laws and or regulations for how your grant is supposed to be functioning and operating. And so they will do that through assessing the progress of your project implementation, making sure that you're spending money on time, making sure that you're spending money in the right ways, and that you're implementing your project as planned. And then they'll also, of course, be reviewing performance data on your project to make sure that you're achieving benchmarks and goals as well. And so the way that TA and compliance will be showing up are essentially what you see on your screen. For technical assistance, we have a EED Technical Assistance Center. It's a contractor who contracted through AEM. Some of you that have worked on whether it's American History and Civics or other grant programs like SEED, TSL, or TQP within the Effective Educator Development Division will be familiar with AEM Incorporated. We've been working with them for a number of years as our technical assistance provider. And they do a great job of planning activities that really support the efforts of grantees. And so they will work with you to develop a logic model, develop a project plan to make sure that you're able to stay on track as you implement your project. We will also have an annual EED Grantee Summit, and we generally have topical webinars that they produce as well as peer-to-peer grantee connections. And then, of course, they will work with grantees to set up communities of practice and targeted supports as well. On a monitoring side, you'll have periodic progress monitoring meetings with your program officer that just recently introduced themselves to you. And then, of course, we will have brief periodic targeted check-ins, and then there's also a semi-annual interim performance report and an annual performance report that you all will be submitting as well every year. Let's talk really quickly about lines of communication. So it's really, really important for us to make sure that communication between your program officer and your grant is accurate and is consistent. And the way that we do that is making sure that any communication sort of is funneled through the project director. And so in some cases, we'll have a project that has a lot of moving pieces and a lot of individuals, and oftentimes there's multiple individuals that are reaching out to the program officer at once. It is our policy to make sure that the project director is the official sort of spokesperson on behalf of your grant. And so if you have information that needs to be communicated to the program officer, it needs to come from the program, from the project director. On the other side of that, the program officer will make sure that any communication that they have, any official sort of communication, significant correspondence, any guidance, any official letters, anything that's coming directly from us to your grant is going to go directly to the to the project director, and it'll be the project director's responsibility to identify if there are alternate points of contact they want us to sort of communicate with, or if there is like I said, a secondary point of contact, or if there is, if they're going to be taking a break or a vacation or an extended, sabbatical or something like that, and there's another individual that we need to communicate with. But generally speaking, we will communicate directly with the project director. And if you are sending information or sending questions directly to your program, to myself or to the program officer, and you are not the project director, then we will ask you to make sure that that information is submitted through them. All right, so getting started. Let's start off with grant award notification. So the first thing that you should have received in relation to this grant from the U.S. Department of Education is a grant award notification, or a GAN as we call it for short, which you should have received on September 29th, 2025. And so that was the initial notification that you received from the U.S. Department of Education indicating that you had been selected for funding. The GAN provides a wealth of information about your grant, but some of the things that we'll highlight are the award amounts. It'll tell you what your grant's period of performance is. It will indicate what the terms of the grant are, and then it'll also indicate if there are any special conditions that have been placed on the grant. And so it's really, really important for you to make sure that you review the GAN, so that you're aware of, like I said, any special conditions, that you're aware of all the terms. The terms really outline your conduct on the grant. They point you to various regulations. They point you to specific practices that you need to make sure that you're adhering to. And it's just really, really important that you review the GAN. It's also important that you review the GAN to make sure that the information on the GAN about your grant is correct. The name of your organization should be correct. The name of the project director and their contact information should be correct also. Oftentimes, an organization will apply for a grant, and it's maybe the grant writer who's not directly affiliated with the organization that may put their name on the application, or it might be just sort of a random person at the organization. It might be the leader of the organization who's not going to actually be running the grant. So you want to make sure that the project director on the grant is the actual person that we will be communicating with on a day-to-day basis, and that's the individual who's going to have actual control and oversight of the grant project. So in addition to that initial grant award notification that you all received, you all received a supplemental GAN, okay? And so that supplemental GAN is a second GAN that you received. And the purpose of that GAN was to provide you all with notification that you had been granted funding for years 2 and 3 of your grant project. And here at the Department of Education, we call that front loading. So essentially what we did in your first GAN is we told you, here is your year 1 funding, right? This is the funding that you will have from October 1st, 2025 through September 30th, 2026. And then in that second GAN, we used the remaining funding that we had available to us to provide you with the full funding for your year 2 and your year 3 awards, okay? So in your G5 balance, which we'll talk a little bit about G5 in a moment, you have all 3 years of funding for your grant already available to you, okay? And so I want you to pay really, really close attention to the terms of the supplemental GAN, because there are some restrictions on how you can use your year 2 and your year 3 funding, okay? And you'll see right there in red text. I don't use a lot of red text, okay? Maybe a little trauma from my school days, but I don't use a lot of red text, when I do webinars, but I will use it when there's something really, really important that I want you to pay attention to. And so what you see there in that red text in the 4th bullet is that grantees are not permitted to use year 2 and year 3 funding prior to the start of those periods of performance. Okay, so if your grant, if we gave you $1 million, let's say if we gave you $500,000 for year 1, you're able to use $500,000 for year 1 project activities. Maybe you'll only need $450,000 for year 1 project activities. And we can certainly talk about that a little bit later. But what you're not able to do is use $550,000, right? And sort of start to peel away funds from your year 2 budget or your year 3 budgeted funds. You can only use the amount of funds for each project year, the maximum amount of funds for each project year, as to what is budgeted for that year. And so we will talk about that. You will hear from your program officer on that topic as well, and probably on a quarterly basis at a minimum, your program officers will be reminding you of that. Okay. And then the final thing that I just want to say here is that all grantees, every grantee received a special condition on their GAN related to the front-loaded funds. So again, another reason why I want you all to take a look at your GANs, make sure that you're looking at the special clauses and the terms that are there as well. While we're talking about grant conditions, I do want to point out that there are 3 pre-award status designations that that exists in the portfolio of 85 grants that I told you that we made. And so all of you will have at least one, some of you will have all 3. And so I'm just going to kind of walk through what those things are right now. So the first thing is budget reductions. And so during the shutdown, when I came back, I was overwhelmed with questions, not totally overwhelmed, but somewhat overwhelmed with questions from grantees, from new grantees regarding their budget, right? And so in some cases, you may have requested, $1 million for the budget for your year 1 budget, and you found that we approved 950,000, right? Or we approved 900,000. Now, I'll assure you, we never just reduced a budget simply because we wanted to give you less money than you requested. We 100% of the time reduced a budget because there were activities that we found proposed in your project that were either costs, I should say, that were proposed that were either unallowable, they were unallocable, they were unreasonable, or we found them to not be necessary for project success, right? And so, at the department, we are always bound by what are, I just described, which are called the cost principles that we have to sort of grade every budget by, right? And so when we find activities that are either unallowable, unallocable, the cost of them is unreasonable, or we find that they're not necessary for your project, it's our responsibility to make reductions. So I won't get into any specific budget reductions that we made on, during this webinar. When you meet with your program officer, they will sit down with you. They will look at your budget. They will talk to you a little bit about, the decisions that were made in the pre-award, phase to make sure that we right-sized your budget based on those cost principles. The second thing, and I won't get into it too much, we talked a little bit about grant conditions already. And then the third thing that I'll mention is route payment. So route payment is a status at the Department of Education that I'll talk about in a little bit also. And some of you will have already recognized, if you're trying to maybe draw down funds in the last few days, you'll realize that you've been placed on route payment status. And so what that does is it blocks you from being able to pull down funds immediately until after your program officer has reviewed the spending request. And so we'll talk. So I think I kind of described a lot of this already, but the pre-award budget reviews really just sort of reflect the fact that prior to receiving the grant award notice, the program team did review every budget for all 3 years to make sure that they were in keeping with the cost principles. And so in cases where an expenditure did not meet those standards, we reduced the budget. And so, as I mentioned before, your program officer will sit down with you and make sure that you're clear on why those budget reductions were made. And if a budget reduction was made, there is an expectation also that you will provide a revised budget. So we will, so they will work with you directly on that as well. And in some cases, I'll be included in those conversations. And so some of the common things that we reduced, just so you can kind of have a sense. This is not, an exhaustive list, but food and catering expenses, almost in every instance where we find that, except under very, very strict circumstances, we will reduce, food and catering expenses. Okay. Tuition for graduate assistants. Found a lot of that this time around. We usually don't see that in this program, but we did find in a lot of instances there were applicants who were proposing to cover tuition costs for graduate assistants in addition to salaries that they were going to be paid also. We found a lot of excessive travel requests, a lot of international travel requests as well. We reduced budgets for that. Unallowable things like, gifts, swag, you know, um, uh, yeah, just, gifts and swag, t-shirts, things like, things that are nice to have, but not necessary all the time. Things like gift cards, which we're not allowed to permit under this program as well. A lot of instances where we found just generally expenditures that didn't have an explanation. It was just travel and a $250,000 figure associated with it, but no explanation as to what that travel was for. And so, unfortunately, that's just not sufficient information for us to be able to justify a cost that high of, something under a particular budget line. And then, recalculated indirect costs always happen whenever we cut budget items or budget, categories that, for which indirect costs can be calculated. And so, as I mentioned, it's not an exhaustive list, but just want to kind of give you guys some examples of the types of reductions that we will make, or the types of things that we will see in a proposed budget that we would have to cut. And so really quickly, I won't spend a lot of time here because I think I spoke at length already about grant conditions. And so the one thing I just will kind of highlight is just, as a result of, the reviews that were done, there were some applications that, have proposed activities that conflict with the department's policies, prioritizing merit, fairness, excellence, etc. And so in those cases, grants were either placed on route payment, and if a grant is on route payment, the grantee will be required to work with the program officer to revise their application, their proposed project, just to make sure that we can remove that status. And then, of course, if there are additional, conditions, then of course, once those sort of status, conditions are met, that we can go ahead and remove that status. And so when we talk about grant conditions, there's usually two reasons why we have implemented grant conditions. And so on the right side, we kind of talked about front loading already, right? Like every grant here received their front loaded year 2 and year 3 continuation funds. And, when that happens, you're not able to pull down year 2 and year 3 funds from G5 until year 2 and or year 3. Okay. But on the left side, what I wanted to show you here is that if you received a grant condition, there's also some kind of a risk designation. That's a possibility as well. And so in addition to the front loading, the front loading condition, which applies to everyone, a number of grantees also had some kind of a risk designation, right? And so if you had a risk designation, you are definitely one of the grantees whose grant is on route payment status. And so we'll work with you so that you have, certain level of technical support, and you're able to ensure that your project meets all the goals and adheres to all the federal requirements. And so you might be asking, like, what would a risk designation be? A risk designation could be something as simple as, this is the first, Department of Education grant that your organization has ever had, right? And so for us, there is some level of inherent risk associated with awarding $250,000 or $500,000 or $1 million, or, if we talk about 3 years, $3 million to an organization that's never had a federal grant, never managed a federal grant before. And so for us, route payment is the right sort of mitigation strategy for that risk to make sure that we are able to have some level of oversight and visibility into the spending that a grantee is doing. Another risk designation could be, for example, the department has an office that calculates risk based on a grantee's performance. So if you have other grants at the U.S. Department of Education, and perhaps you've been on route payment status for another grant, or maybe you've carried a large available balance, from one year into the next, or you ended your grant with a significant remaining balance. Those are the kinds of things that would cause you to have some kind of a risk status designation within the Department of Education. And for those reasons, if we identified that while we were making your grant, then that would be the reason why we put your grant on route payment as well. Okay, so again, this is just to kind of give you a little bit of insight into the thought process that we employ when we're making new awards, and your program officer has all of the information specific to your grant, and so they will work with you to make sure that you are exactly clear on what were the circumstances that led to you being on route payment and having that grant condition, if that is the case. And so a little bit about what route payment looks like in G6. Route payment, I think as I mentioned before, it is a flag in G6 that routes payment. That's why it's called route payment. It routes payment requests to program offices for approval. In normal cases, when there is no route payment status, you go to G5, you say, I want to, draw down $100,000 from my account. You draw down those funds, and it goes directly into your external bank account. Okay, when it's route payment, there's a pause there, and it pauses sort of for the program officer to take a look. Program officer is notified, and then they will ask you to provide information about what that drawdown actually entails, so that they can make a decision about whether or not it's approved or not. Okay, and so we will work with you all to understand that process and to make sure that there's a streamlined way for us to expedite your payment requests and make sure that you're able to get a free, as free as possible flow of funds to your project. The program office will approve drawdown requests, as I mentioned before, after the grantee has substantially demonstrated that the request is in keeping with the cost principles and it aligns with planned project expenditures and timelines. So a little bit of what I mentioned before. And, route payment flags are generally not permanent. They can be removed once the program office has assurances that the grant has satisfactorily addressed the circumstances that led to the route payment flag. And like I mentioned before, there are different circumstances as to why a route payment flag will be instituted in the first place. If the route payment flag is just that, hey, you're a new organization, you don't have any risk history with the Department of Education, it takes time for the department to develop trust with your organization. So the route payment flag will probably last longer than if it were something where perhaps there was a misunderstanding about your grant and we put a flag on you and then you corrected those and then we were able to remove it pretty readily. Right. So let's talk a little bit right now about what it'll be like interfacing with ed staff. And so really three primary modes of sort of interaction with the ed team. First of all, you'll have quarterly virtual monitoring meetings, which I will walk you through what that looks like shortly. You'll also have we will have annual project directors meetings, and those generally take place in Washington, D.C. We don't have one planned for right now, but that is TBD. And then, of course, there's always, routine email and telephone communications as well. And so before all that starts, as I mentioned before, you'll have a post-award initial check-in meeting that'll kind of serve as your first quarterly monitoring meeting. And you will, your program officer will coordinate with you to schedule that meeting, okay, which should happen sometime between the end of this month and mid-December. I think one or two meetings, if I'm not mistaken, has taken place already, which is great. And I would just encourage you all, if your program officer has been in touch with you about scheduling meetings and you have not yet provided dates of availability, please do that as soon as possible so we can get that done. Really trying to get these done before the holidays to make sure that you have, all the supports that you need to be able to move forward in your grant. And so the objectives of the post-award check-in meeting are as follows. It differs a little bit from a normal monitoring meeting because a lot of it is really just sort of getting to know you. And so this is really an opportunity for the program officer and the grant team to meet one another, right? Our program officer and your grant team to really get a sense of, whom, one another are, and really start to sort of establish some norms and some routines and really get a sense of, how, the relationship working together over the next several years is going to work. It's also an opportunity for the program officer to learn more about your project, right? So you will have probably in the area of 10 to 15 minutes to really just do an overview of your project, project objectives, make sure that the program officer understands what you're trying to accomplish and how they can best support you. The program officer is going to also review with you any necessary budget modifications, right? Like any changes, any budget like revisions based on the pre-award budget review that took place. And then they're really, going to want to try to make sure that any questions that you have are able to be answered. And then also the program officer is going to bring questions as well. So they're going to kind of put you on the spot. And there's going to be things about their project that they're going to want to learn from you also. And then we kind of talked about the desktop monitoring, right? And so the quarterly desktop monitoring will happen, self-explanatory, it happens on a quarterly basis. We have 4 meetings. There's a fall one that happens usually in late October through mid-November. There's a winter meeting that's usually sort of mid to late February. Sometimes might bleed a little bit into early March, or it might start a little bit sooner, late January or so. There's a spring meeting that usually happens in mid-May and lasts to early June, and then we have summer meetings to sort of close out the year as well, which happen in mid to late August. But in general, these desktop monitoring conversations will last, anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the agenda and what things need to be discussed. They will be the primary mode of monitoring. Okay. Generally speaking, they're going to occur, as I mentioned before, on a quarterly basis, and they're focused primarily on the implementation of your project and the drawdowns that you've made from G6 as far as project costs are concerned. And then, of course, the program officer is going to try to schedule these ahead of time. They're going to give you plenty of notice to make sure, at least 2 to 4 weeks, to make sure that you have notice and the opportunity to invite everyone who needs to be there to contribute. And the frequency of these meetings can often increase depending on how you are implementing your grant. So if there are challenges that you are experiencing while you're implementing your project, we might move from a quarterly to like a bi-monthly schedule or a monthly schedule. The goal is just to make sure that you have as much support as you need as you're implementing your grant. Okay. And then, of course, there's the opportunity to interact outside of scheduled monitoring meetings. So the one thing that I don't want you to feel like is that you can only reach out and to your grantee, to your program officer during the scheduled monitoring meetings that you're going to have. And you should feel very comfortable reaching out to your program officer at any point if you have a question, or if you need support, or if you need guidance, or if you're looking for some kind of a connection with another grantee or whatever. And so I'm encouraging you to reach out to your program officer directly for any support or technical assistance that you may have. And we have a large portfolio, so I'm going to ask you to be patient and allow for, some time for them to respond. But generally speaking, even though we say 24 to 48 hours, most of our program officers they're gonna respond to you probably within the first, half of a workday or so. It's just the way that they operate. And so another thing that we'll be doing is our program officers are always, because they have a wide portfolio of grantees, and they're hearing different things that other grantees are working on. They're always looking for connections. And so they will seek out opportunities to connect you with other grantees who may be able to share best practices or, lessons learned, or just to collaborate, and we've had lots of really, particularly on this program, lots of really great examples that, that I could share or that they could share with how those connections have been made, to really enhance and sort of, really improve on the quality, the caliber of, implementation within the portfolio. So be on the lookout for those kinds of opportunities as well, and just sort of be ready when a program officer, when you're sharing a challenge that you're having, just be ready for them to, to propose, connections with other grantees, because that's something that happens pretty routinely. And then, of course, there will also be opportunities to engage with other grantees at, various, convenings that we will host as well. All right, so probably for the next little bit of time, I'm going to focus a little bit on what it's actually like implementing your grant. And so the first thing that I want to kind of lead off with is something that you'll hear today several times from me. You'll hear it in the next several weeks when you meet with your program officer. You will hear it in a couple of months when they meet with you again. You'll hear it just over and over and over and over and over, because it's something that we truly believe in at the Department of Education, particularly within the Effective Educator Development Division. And that thing that you're going to hear over and over and over again is that funding equals activities. Okay, and so you're probably wondering what that means, and really what that means is that the funding that you have been awarded, right? If you're looking at your GAN and you're seeing that you've got roughly $3 million, to spend over the next 3 years, what you must understand is that $3 million has to be tied to specific project activities that are part of your proposed or part of your approved at this stage planned project. Okay. It's not a sort of slush fund that you can kind of, come up with new ideas or new, activities or new sort of things to spend money on. And so the every dollar that you spend needs to be connected to a specific planned activity for your project. And we'll get into what that means in a little bit more detail. But what I want to say is that, the department awards grantees, funds to carry out the specific project activities identified in their approved grant application. And I also want to add, within the specific time frame outlined in their approved grant application. So you were granted X amount of dollars for a 3-year grant project. The expectation is that project is finished in 3 years. It's not finished in 3 years plus an additional 6 months or 9 months or a year for a no-cost extension or something like that. The expectation is that by the time September 30, 2028 rolls around, your project is completely finished. You've finished all the activities. You've bought or purchased all of the supplies and or pieces of equipment or anything that needs to be accomplished as a part of your project should be finished by September 30th, 2028. Also want to make sure that you all are aware that funding spent and unspent directly affects outcomes for educators and students within the participating district and in non-participating districts. Okay, and so that's kind of important for you to understand, because the way that the funds are sort of spent has a direct impact on the people that are supposed to be receiving, the services and the activities. But also, one of the things that I want to make sure that you're aware of is that when we make awards to a grantee, the funds that you receive are funds that another grantee that did not receive funds did not receive. Okay, and so it's important to us to make sure that the funding is spent as it is intended to be spent, because there were grantees that did not receive funding. There were applicants, I'm sorry, that did not receive funding. And it's unfair to those applicants who did not receive funding when grantees have funds allocated to them that they are either unable to spend, or that they over budgeted, or that they're trying to spend in ways that are not for how they were intended. And then finally, I'll just say that funding spent and unspent also directs the amount of funding that's approved for subsequent project years. And so what our team will be doing is working closely with you to make sure that we are at all times right sizing your budget, that your budget is right sized. That if you have a project, if you have a million dollars of funds for year one, but you only really need $750,000, that you have the $750,000 you need, but that we're actually reducing the budget of any excess funds that you don't need, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about what project changes and all that kind of stuff looks like, but the idea is that you are not amending and changing and reshaping your project to the amount of funding that's available. The idea is that you are constantly right sizing the amount of funds that are available to the amount of funds that are needed to implement and execute the project as was originally designed and intended. So I want to share with you a couple of key budgetary definitions that will maybe provide a little bit of insight into where we're going to go in the next few slides. So first of all, anticipated unexpended funds. This is sort of almost leapfrogging to the end of the fiscal year, of the budget period. But I think it's important that as we kind of kick off this grant cycle, that we put a few things in your minds just to make sure that you're aware of. And so as we start to implement our projects and we start to look at what activities are going to be able to be completed, the goal obviously is that you're completing activities on time, but we know that life happens, and there are times when a particular project may go a little bit over time in terms of, or a particular project activity may be delayed a little bit, okay, is how I'll say it. And so when that happens, sometimes it'll stretch from one project period to the next project period. And in those cases, your program officer will work with you closely to identify what those activities are, how much additional time you might need, etc. And so in those cases, we will identify what is called an anticipated unexpended funds. And these are essentially the funds that a grant expects will remain after all planned project activities for a given performance period have been completed, right? And what I described previously is carryover activities, right? So the activities that will extend beyond September 30th into the next project year, and we still want you to complete those activities. You still have the ability to complete those activities, right? You have the capacity to do it, but you just need a little bit of extra time to do it, right? And so with that being the case, your program officer will work with you closely to make sure that they are able to identify what those activities are, okay? Rollover funds are the portion of a grantee's balance that reflects unused funds from the previous performance period. So when October 1 of the next project year, the first day of the next project year rolls around, my team is always going to be looking at, on October 1st, how much funding was still there, okay? If you have $1 million grant, I love to use that $1 million example, but if you have $1 million grant and $100,000 are of year one funds are still in your G5 account or G6 account on October 1st, then we immediately want to know what portion of that rollover amount, what portion of that $100,000 is actually for approved carryover activities, okay? And the portion that is attributed to approved carryover activities is what we will call carryover funds. It might be $15,000 to pay stipends to educators that attended, a summer professional learning session, $15,000. If 15,000 is all that's left of carryover money, carryover funds, then the remaining $85,000 belongs to the department, and those are the funds that we will reduce from your budget. So I kind of went around the world there trying to explain the difference between anticipated unexpended, carryover activities, rollover funds, carryover as well. If people have questions about that, I'm happy to put it. Go ahead and put it in the chat. I'll be happy to answer. At the end, your program officer will also be happy to explain as well. Your program officers are experts in identifying the difference between carryover funds and the portion of rollover that that needs to be returned to the department. But I wanted to make sure that you guys were aware of that. And then the last bullet that you'll see there, again, I don't use red a lot, but I use it for the important things. Unexpended funds do not equal carryover funds. And it's really, really important for you to understand that. Just because you carried over that 100,000 does not mean that you get to spend that funding any way that you want to. If you have 100,000 in unexpended funds and only 15,000 of it is needed, you will be able to spend that 15,000, but as I mentioned before, the remaining 85,000 of it will come back to the department. All right, so let's talk a little bit about project changes, because this is something that comes up a lot, okay? Project and budget changes. And if there's anything that our program officers will probably spend half of this fiscal year doing, it is having conversations with you all about changes to your projects and changes to your budgets. And that probably is conservative. And so grantees are, as I mentioned before, expected to implement their project as designed in the original application and complete all approved activities within the grant's period of performance. Okay, so ultimately what we're saying there is you all sent us an application, and in that application there was a plan and a proposal for a project, and you indicated what you expect the cost to be and what the activities are, and we expect you to implement it as designed. Okay, when you sent that application to the department and when we approved it, you entered a compact, with the U.S. Department of Education. And what that compact is saying is that I'm going to do all these things, and it's going to cost this much, and I'm going to do it within this time period, and that's it. When you start to deviate from that, it's almost like you are, breaking a contract essentially. Okay, and so we definitely are going to push hard to make sure that you are delivering that work, to specification the way that you designed it and the way that we approved it. And so, any action to amend the project's list of planned activities, their impact, or the timeline for completion will require approval by the program office. Okay, so if you're saying, this was our plan initially, but things changed, and we need to have a conversation with the department about how we can maybe amend our project just a bit to sort of take into effect this set of circumstances that changed or what have you. Those are conversations that we will have with you, but we will have to have a conversation. You can't just implement that change. Okay. The department will not approve a project change that alters the scope of the project. Okay, so that is something that we are not permitted to do. Anything that changes the scope of your project, we will not be able to do. And we'll talk in a moment about what a project that changes this, or a change that alters the scope of your project would look like. And then finally, I'll just say really quickly that regardless of the size of the planned project modification, grantees must discuss the program officer discuss with the program officer to determine if a formal request is required. And so irrespective of what change you want to make to your budget, just rule of thumb, always make sure you're having that sort of open and clear communication with your program officer. They will let you know the extent to which, if there's something that you're thinking about changing, will warrant a formal request, or whether it won't warrant a formal request, but you want to make sure that that you are communicating with them first. And so let's talk really, really quickly about what constitutes, a change in project or scope. And it's probably three major categories, not exclusive to these things, but these are the types of things that we see most often. So first, adding a new activity to the project plan, huge no-no. Okay, adding a new, for example, adding a new professional development activity that was not previously planned. Okay, that's not something that we're going to be able to approve. Okay, remember, we're always trying to get you to implement and execute the project as it was originally designed in your original application. That was approved, that was scored by a panel of reviewers, and probably rated over. Not probably, it was scored over applicants who did not receive funding. Okay, so can't allow you to receive a score and receive a rating on an application, beat out applicants that did not receive funding, and then just completely change your project. It's not fair to them. It's not fair to the department. It's not fair to your stakeholders. And then, of course, shifting funds to cover costs to add, a new data system is another example, that I gave there. Increasing the amount of an activity or a scale. This is pretty common. This happens often. We get a lot of questions about this. And again, this is something that would be considered a change in project scope, and we cannot approve this. So it would be sort of imagine if your application says that you're going to do three cohorts, and you're going to do one for each year. And then you say, well, you know what? We didn't get as many people for cohort 3, so we want to actually run a 4th cohort, to make up for it. That's just not something that we're able to permit. Okay, we provided the funding for 3 cohorts, irrespective of whether you hit that target or not. 3 cohorts is what it's got to be. Okay, including an additional professional development session is sort of, we have this professional development series, but we decided later that we wanted to add this new module. Okay, that's not something, again, because again, you're changing the scope of the project. And increasing the number of teacher or school leader participants. Again, seems simple. We initially we planned to have 75 or 100, say 100, participants in our professional development activity. But the demand was overwhelming, and it turns out we can support 200. And we want to divert some funds to do that. Again, that would be a change in project scope. And then finally, altering the target population for the project services. And so this is one that doesn't seem as critical to a lot of grantees until we explain to them the reason why this is important. And so, adding participating schools and districts often changes the composition of how of the sort of the demographic groups that are being supported. Okay, and then replacing schools or districts with different demographics. So if your project was focused on urban educators or rural educators, and then all of those schools drop out, and then we want to replace all those rural educators in school districts with urban school districts. Okay, so now we're supporting different students, and we're impacting different students with those services. And so that's a conversation that needs to happen. And at a minimum, of course, we're not going to penalize you if if the partnerships with those schools don't work out. However, we are going to hold you accountable for making sure that the same types of students, when you replace those districts, are being supported. The same types of educators are being supported. So again, any of those things would be considered a change in project scope. And so we do have a formal grantee request process, and so I'll show you that briefly. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but what I will say is that the formal grantee requests are really going to be for things like budget modifications, project changes or amendments, right? So we talked a little bit about project changes. We talked about what would constitute a change in scope. Key personnel changes, so the project director moves on, or the project director's designee moves on, and we need to make an updated G5. And so we'll ask you first to provide, obviously the name and the contact information of that person, as well as that individual's resume, so we can make sure that they have the appropriate expertise. And then if, when we're talking about carryover requests, that's something as well. And then there's a space for other types of requests. And so This is the EED grantee request form. And so following this meeting, your program officer will reach out to you. They'll provide you with a link to the form. They'll also provide you with a guidance document that you'll be able to use as well. But ultimately, this form is a tool that we use to sort of streamline the process of grantee requests. And we'll ask you not to, you can make an informal request of your program officer and notify them that you will be sending the formal request. But for tracking purposes, for data gathering and analysis, we do ask you to, and just for streamlining, we ask you to use the grantee request form whenever you're making an official and formal request. So let's talk about some general budget considerations. As you all know by now, G6 is the department's grant system, and it's used to manage grantee drawdowns. I think we transitioned from G5 to G6 probably less than a year ago, maybe just a little bit over a year ago. So those of us that have been at the department for a while and saying G5, you'll still hear us say G5. Those of us that are newer, you'll probably hear them saying G6, or those that just are not so tied to the name G5, you'll hear say G6. But they are used interchangeably, and they are the same system. Generally, kind of like we talked about before, funds drawn down equal project activities completed. So we're always looking to see that if you are drawing down funds, you're not doing it just to be doing it. You're doing it because there is some particular activity that either you're getting ready to implement that requires you to draw down the funds, or that you are reimbursing yourself for an activity that was already completed. You're pulling down the funds for that purpose. I'm going to ask you all to remember to abide by the 3-day rule, which requires the expenditure of funds to be the sort of the drawdown to happen within 3 days of the expenditure of the funds to happen within 3 days of the receipt, right? So you're receiving the funds, you're drawing them down from G5, and within 3 days, you need to be utilizing those funds. And the reason for that is because you are not permitted to accrue interest on funds that you draw down from the federal government. So if you pull down funds and then those funds sit in your account for a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, during that 4-month period, you are actually accruing interest on it, and that is not permissible under federal statute, so under federal regulations. So we are going to ask you to make sure that you're abiding by that 3-day rule. And I recognize fully that when I sort of got my initial training at the department, it was a 3-day rule. I've heard other people say it's a 5-day rule. Some people have said it's a 7-day rule. Whatever the number of days is, it's not a 30-day rule. So within a reasonable period of time, you need to utilize those funds to make sure that you're not accruing interest on them. And then just keep in mind that, your program officer is going to be monitoring your drawdowns on a monthly basis to make sure that, you're making adequate, progress spending your grant. And so a couple of other general considerations related to the budget is that, grantees often overestimate the funds they need for their projects. We know this, we have really good data on this. We know that probably on average, grantees over budget by somewhere from 10 to 15%. And so, the budget reductions that we made, some of you have already reached out to me and said, hey, you guys made some pretty steep budget reductions. And the reason for that is because we look at the cost principles and we make sure that your budget is in alignment with those. But at the same time, we also recognize that there's often, I don't have a better term to use, but there's often a little bit of fluff, in those budgets as well. A little bit of cushion maybe is a better word. And so to the extent that we identify cushion, we will remove cushion. But just keep in mind, it's not personal. It's just, we are always monitoring budgets to make sure that you have what you need and that you don't have anything more than you do need. Okay. And then just a few other budget considerations. Grantees are required to maintain and provide a valid and direct cost rate agreement and use a training indirect cost rate when they're making calculations. And so if you don't have an indirect cost rate agreement, at the present time, you're able to use the temporary rate, which is 8%. You must submit a proposed indirect cost rate agreement within 90 days after the date your grant is awarded. So if you do not have an indirect cost rate agreement, I hope you've been working on that. And so, if there is information that you need regarding indirect cost rates, I have a link here that you can click to get that information. And also, if you want more information and want to talk with someone directly about indirect costs, you can actually visit the webpage of the indirect cost rate division here at the department. And so you guys will get a copy, as I mentioned before, of this slide deck, and you're able to to click straight through to those links for more information. Let's talk really quickly about project spending benchmarks. And so these are very, very generic standard benchmarks. You see here sort of when the quarters end. Quarter one is, ends on December 31st, quarter two, March 31st, quarter three, June 30th, and of course, quarter four, the project year ends September 30th. And we expect that you should be spending approximately 25% of your yearly budget with each of those benchmarks. Now, I'll be completely honest with you. I recognize that American History and Civics functions a little bit differently sometimes than some of the other grant programs of the Department of Education. And so it may not be possible for you to spend, 25% by, December 31st. Or 50% by, March 31st, especially if the vast majority of your project activities are going to be happening. The vast majority of your expenditures are going to be happening in the summer. And so if that is the case for your project, my recommendation to you is just to make sure that you are in constant communication with your program officer, and that they have a general idea of when your drawdowns will be taking place. Okay, if you know that you are not going to be drawing down any funds, or it's going to be a trickle in quarters one and quarter two, then just make sure your program officer is aware of that. Because when I ask them, then they're able to communicate with me and let me know that you're in good standing, you're in good shape, and there will be bigger drawdowns in quarters 3 and 4. I would say, in addition to that, if you know that you've got expenditures that are going to activities that are completed by September 30th, but expenditures that aren't going to be drawn down until the next project year, make sure we know that as well, because we want to again be able to sort of pinpoint how much of that sort of that rollover amount, right? The amount that stays in your G5 account from one year to the next. We want to know how much of that is for legitimate experiences or activities and experiences. If they're not for planned activities or things that have happened, or drawdowns that we know that are coming in a week or 2 weeks or a month, then we are going to target those for reductions. We want to make sure that we have clear communication about what those are going to look like. All right, I'm going to talk really quickly about performance reporting, and then after that, we are going to jump into a Q&A period. So really, really briefly, grantees are required to submit an APR during each year of the project and a final performance report at the end of the project. And the sort of intention for the APR is for the grantee to be able to demonstrate progress they've made in meeting approved project objectives across all years of the grant. Okay, and so the APR and the final report and the FPR will include the following information. They'll have detailed financial information. They will also talk about the performance or the progress that you've made on various performance indicators, right? So there's the Government Performance and Results Act, or we call it GEPRA, here at the Department of Education, performance measures. And so for this project, there is one performance measure, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And then, of course, all of your projects will have multiple project-specific performance measures as well, which you indicated in your application. These are the things that you're saying. These are what are specifically important to us. These are the measures that will help us know if our projects are successful or not. And so the GEPRA performance measure really just says that for each year of the project, grantees are required to meet the following measure. It basically says that, you know, you have to show, right, the percentage of participants who demonstrate through pre and post assessments an increased understanding of American history, civics and government, and geography. Okay, we don't provide you with a target. There's no target there. You will have to provide us with what your target is. Okay, and so the idea here is that you are conducting pre and post assessments, and through those pre and post assessments, you are measuring the impact that your seminars and your project activities will have on participants, understanding of the various, sort of subject matter disciplines that comprise this project. Okay. A couple of things that I'll say there. We do not prescribe for you. Again, we don't prescribe for you what your performance target should be. You're just showing us what that difference is. Okay. We also don't prescribe for you what the assessment should be. Some grantees and past, iterations of this program have interpreted assessment to mean the state assessment. Okay. Some use a district assessment. Some use interim assessments. Some have designed assessments. All of the above is acceptable for this project or for this program. Okay, it's really up to you to sort of determine what fits best for your project and for your constituents. And then, as I mentioned before, there's project-specific measures. And so in addition to reporting on the program's GEPRA measures, grantees are required to submit annual information on progress toward meeting the project-specific measures. And so, you should list what those project-specific measures are. You should also have, again, performance targets for each measure during each year of your project, not just at the end. That's sort of a common thing that happens is we'll often meet with grantees and they have a sense of where they want people to end after 3 years, but we need to be able to see progress for each year of the project. So we do need you to have annual performance targets. And then, of course, we want to see a plan for how your performance data is being collected. Right. And so as I mentioned before, like early on, there are two annual collection sort of periods, right? There's a mid-year interim performance report submission, and then there's also an end-of-year annual performance report submission. And so the mid-year performance submission is really it's comprised of four elements. The first is the executive summary, right, which is a narrative essay form that really describes to your program officer and to the department and to the public, because these are public reports once they're submitted. It really just describes the progress that you have made implementing your project, right? Describes the work that you've done, the activities that have been completed, the activities that haven't been completed, any challenges that you may have faced, any sort of highlights, and implementation that you want to share as well. And then it also it really gets into your budget expenditures through midpoint, right? How much funding have you spent? What have you spent it on, et cetera, as well as your projected expenditures through the end of the year. And then, there's the sort of narrative budget justification where you're sort of saying, this is what we've spent, why we spent it, why it was important, why it was necessary for project, success. And then finally, you're going to provide us with your performance targets for your GEPRA measure, as well as your project-specific performance measures as well. For the end-of-year annual performance report, you're providing us with end-of-year actual budget expenditures. So you're saying, here is, what we spent for the second half of the year from April 1st until September 30th. You're providing us with the actual outcomes, right? The actual results from your GEPRA measure and your project-specific measures. And then you're providing us with grantee, project objective performance data as well. And so what you see on the screen here is the performance reporting schedule for the current project year. In March, by mid-March, you will gain access to the interim performance reporting form and guidance. We'll do a webinar around the around the end of March. And then the report will be due to the Department of Education on April 30th by 5 p.m. Okay. We'll have on October 19th, we will flip to the end of year annual performance report. And so you will have access to the end of year APR forms and the guidance, and that'll be sent to you. You will already be in the second year of your project by that time, so you'll receive that information then. But you'll be reporting on everything that happened during the first year of your project. By October 29th, we'll have a webinar, and then on December 7th, 2026, the end of year APR will be due to the Department of Education. Right, so I just wanted to close with a little bit of sort of 6 months at a glance, what the first, half of the first year of your project is going to look like. And so by no later than December 19th, 2025, you will, participate in your post-award meeting with your program officer, okay? And they will walk through a protocol that they'll have access to, which is really intended to help them get to know you better and for you to get to know them better, and to make sure that by the end of that meeting, everything that you need to know about how you're going to be implementing your project over the next 3 years, that you have that information. Or if you don't have that information, you'll know that it's coming to you pretty shortly. And then we are also working with our contractor to plan I don't want to call it another new grantee orientation, but really it'll be, it's intended right now to be an in-person new grantee technical assistance meeting to make sure that, we are able to help you kick off your grants, in the right way as well. So right now that's to be determined. We expect that that'll probably happen sometime in spring 2026, and we'll provide more information about that as that information becomes available. And then your first true monitoring meeting will happen sometime between mid-February and maybe the second week of March. Okay, and so that is when your program officer will really start to ask questions about your implementation progress. They'll ask you specific questions about drawdowns that you've made, and that's when we'll really start to get into that sort of compliance monitoring, phase of things. With also an eye on technical assistance as well. And then finally, the last major thing that's going to happen this first sort of 6-month period is, as I mentioned before, the interim performance report. And so the idea being that you all will receive access to the forms and the guidance around March 16th, with the report being due to the department on April 30th. And so that's kind of all I have right now for,